Hey there, Hetty here. The question of whether one requires both female and male divine aspects in one's practice is one of those issues that comes up again and again, but for me anyway, never really gets old. I always find the conversation interesting. I stand firmly on the no, you really don't side of the argument, and today I thought I'd just share a couple of my thoughts on the topic. Obviously, this is not a discussion that can be done justice in a few short minutes, so this will be less than exhaustive, more food for thought. The very short version of why I feel the way I do about this topic is that my position on most practice related questions is do what works. If you feel like balancing male and female principles is good or important, then cool. You should feel free to do that, and I personally don't think you should worry too much about attempting to construct a justification for your particular selection of deities. Certainly not until you've worked with them for a good long while, even if you feel some inkling that you ought to be able to defend the position to yourself, if not to others. Why not try to explain your choice? Well, for starters, believing that we can identify the real reasons for our choice is awfully, even naively optimistic. Despite our, that is people's, tendency to want to feel like all of our decisions are arrived at rationally and build upon considered evaluation, this just isn't the case most of the time. Logical rationales are applied as justification for our feelings or instincts after the fact, far more often than we realize. And we've got solid scientific data to back this up. And we use these post hoc rationalizations as a subtle sort of defense against our own lack of understanding about our motivations. Our general tendency to like feeling in control extends to wanting to believe that we are the masters of our own minds and that we comprehend how we think, but alas, that isn't entirely true either, particularly in cases where no clear correct answer exists. When it comes to such intensely nuanced and subjective decisions as which facets of the divine we're drawn to and wish to work with, it's frankly a little much to hope that we would really be able to parse the entirety of why we feel called to one choice over another. So, although we may understand a few of the components that went into the decision, like we wanted to work with a deity from X pantheon, or we've always felt an affinity for hunter archetypes, trying to grasp the whole of our motivation is a little pointless. But it's not just pointless. I'd like to suggest that it may even be actively counterproductive, because guessing as to the source of our desire to work with so and so could serve to restrict our exploration, our freedom to discover the scores of factors that drew us to the deity and work before we've even had a chance to get going in earnest. Premature guesses apply layers of assumption and limitation to both the relationship we're trying to forge and to the goddess or god we're liaising with. A relationship and a perception of that deity that will change and evolve over time and with experience. Fundamentally, this stance means that I don't think we should feel compelled to rely on conscious and careful analysis when it comes to selecting deities to work with at all, since the secret motives and affinities we'll come to discover are, to me anyway, the heart of why relationships with defined, personalized deity are worth engaging in to begin with. Which isn't to say that we should avoid trying to make decisions about who to work with in a conscious and measured way. All forms of free choice are valid, including ones made for seemingly strategic or political reasons. I just don't think that forcing our choices to adhere to a logical or defensible framework is necessarily a great idea or a great compulsion. And telling the difference between what is a strategic and personally challenging free decision versus a decision made as a result of external pressure isn't always easy because, again, we're pretty bad at evaluating our own subtle motivations on the fly. I think this goes double early on in one's practice because those external factors feel more potent when we are less sure of ourselves and less experienced. Which means that, all told, I think that one's first working relationship with the divine may be best made without any conscious thought or care for social ideals, balance, originality, etc. We can always get around to forging more challenging relationships that aren't such a natural fit later. And if it turns out that doing so becomes somehow important in our practice, we'll probably get around to it anyway. Only by then we'll have some sense of what natural affinity and connection feels like, and so have some basis for comparison as we build bridges with this new deity or group of deities. As I've mentioned before, and so as some of you know, I have a matron deity that I've worked with for several years. And over the past few, I've been working with additional ones, one male and one female, the latter being the goddess my coven works with. In neither case was their incorporation in my practice an intentional effort to apply balance. Here, by the way, is the point at which I ended up redacting about 1,000 words from my first run at this video. Initially, I'd used my own experiences as an example of why, in hindsight, I think that working with a single female deity before introducing others was crucial to, among other things, recognizing and learning to work on some of my shadows. The reason I've axed it all is twofold. Firstly, I don't think that my reasons, or at the very least my perceived reasons, which, like I've just said, are probably only a quarter of the story, really matter. Secondly, my reasons involve life events that many would consider traumatic, and although overcoming personal trauma is obviously a perfectly valid, if not excellent reason for making spiritual decisions, narratives about trauma have, unfortunately, become a sort of go-to preemptive defense for those personal decisions that deviate from some perceived philosophical ideal. And I think there are a couple of problems with this. For one thing, it inherently implies that there is an ideal, not just a norm, but a golden combination that, barring whatever passes for a good enough reason, we should endeavor to subscribe to. And I'm not actually convinced that there is any such thing when it comes to divine representations and deities. Nor am I convinced that constantly reinforcing socially constructed dichotomies between maleness and femaleness is benign, let alone to my benefit. Yet, almost invariably, when people talk about balance among deities, they seem to be thinking about the perceived ideal of a cis-het boy god who has, as a fundamental aspect of identity, the desire to stick his athame in some cis-het girl god's chalice. Rarely is balance considered achieved in the absence of some male-female configuration that allows, even if it doesn't downright demand, the possibility of heterosexual union. Other forms of sexual congress seem to be disqualified from serious consideration almost entirely. And, just once I'd like to hear somebody argue that a truly gender-balanced pantheon must include all 23,000 sexes displayed by Schizophyllum commune fungus. And other means of achieving balance tend to be treated as being of secondary importance, or as being derived from this supposedly central tenet of male-female opposition. Now, this is not to say that the cis-het dichotomy is arbitrary or stupid. If you're going to build a practice around the reproductive cycles of life, it's entirely sensible to elect to have two beings as your deities who, if they were human, would be physically capable of producing viable offspring. There's also no doubt a bias towards this configuration because, for all that plenty of witches don't identify as Wiccan and maintain practices that deviate from Wicca quite a bit, a large proportion of us were nevertheless heavily influenced by Wicca. And that influence exists in more than just the preponderance of circles and elements and cauldrons and our ultimately non-Wiccan practices. It also exists in a tendency to favor male and female pairings because we don't exist in a vacuum, and many of us stood on the shoulders of Wiccans when first trying to find our spiritual footing. The thing is, though, it's pretty clear that the biological requirements of human reproduction have rarely been treated as necessary by the mythologies and pantheon I have come to rely on most in my practice. Which begs the question of why I would then care about this form of balance or fit at all. Various pantheons have examples of deities who were born by parthenogenesis, or cross-species coupling, or via technically intra-species sexual reproduction that nevertheless violates the anatomical requirements because people thousands of years ago had a pretty poor understanding of basic physiology. Looking at you, Athena, who sprang fully formed from Zeus's frothy, semen-filled forehead. So, if you're not going to be limited by anatomy anyway, what difference does having interlocking anatomical bits really make? And if you're not going to subscribe to the attitude that much, if not most, of what we call gender is a social construct, then why demand that representations of so-called male energies be embodied by an image of a stereotypically male deity? Obviously, I could go on, but you get the gist. The takeaway is that I have yet to hear a terribly convincing argument for why dichotomous cis-het male-female sexual representations are necessary, let alone optimal. So the tendency, whether conscious or not, to hold it as a divine ideal strikes me as one that shouldn't go privately unquestioned, particularly not when it gets treated as a de facto community norm or ideal. The second problem, as I see it, with personal trauma being employed as a public rationale for spiritual decisions, is this. It implies that if you don't qualify for a waiver according to some democratically agreed upon poor thingness, then not only are you not justified in adhering to your preferences, you may in fact feel additional pressure to uphold the perceived ideal in some, I don't know, universal effort to shift the average back toward the very narrow definition of equal gender representations laid out a minute ago. This sort of thinking basically demands that we all try to get together and delineate and define what constitutes sufficient hardship, and further attempts to democratize the acceptable levels of emotional, psychological, and spiritual fallout required to make personal decisions as a result. It's basically a spiritual application of the others have it worse trope. Your father leaving made you want to work exclusively with goddesses? How dare you! There are orphaned witches in Africa who still work with male deity. From my perspective, even if we did all agree that matched male-female divine pairs were the ideal, arguments to the effect that unless you have a good reason you should stick to the matched pair model of deity selection err in conflating ideal individual choices with ideal population-wide trends. A confound that's particularly inappropriate when it comes to decisions that are rarely publicly shared or publicly influential. It's like trying to apply the Bechdel test to movies written entirely and exclusively for an audience of one, and then trying to force edits upon anybody who happens to let slip the plot of their private script. All of which is to say that I think we, as complex humans with complex, messy, and mysterious minds, are pretty bad at understanding why we're drawn to some deities over others. I think we're swayed by enough factors that we don't understand that it's perfectly acceptable to throw up our hands and declare that in this, we're just not going to care about cultural ideals and norms, whatever those may be. And I think it behooves us to avoid framing our conversations about how or why we might have ended up working with one god over another as anything that may come off as a defense of that decision. Because in doing so, which is totally understandable and instinctual, we encourage the idea that justifications are required. Justification is not required, whatever way you swing. However we get there, whatever the reasons or experiences that drove us down one path or another in the end, the divine relationships we build are sacrosanct. That's it. A lovely day to you all.